Like several of the prophets, Ezekiel has a lengthy oracles against the nations section in his book. And these oracles were delivered around the time of Jerusalem's destruction in that 587 to 585 window. Let's remind ourselves of the chronology of Ezekiel's oracle with that chart that we looked at earlier. So here we go, the dated oracles in Ezekiel, and these purple ones are the oracles against the nations. And you can tell they're all delivered right around the time of Jerusalem's destruction, 587 to 585. Now this is just Tyre and Egypt, but the same applies with the other nations. Now, these chapters have a pretty deliberate structure. And you could see that there are 7 nations that Ezekiel condemns: Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Sidon, and Egypt. The first 4 nations, he just gives one quick little chapter to, chapter 25. And then the meat of this section is devoted to Tyre, Sidon, kind of taken as a unit, and then Egypt. And each of these 2 nations is given 7 oracles. 7 moments it says something like, the word of the Lord came to me saying. 7 oracles. And you'll notice that at the center of these 2 packets of oracles, there is just a couple verses of hope for Israel, just deep restoration oracles right here. And what's unique is if you count the number of verses to the left, if you count the number of verses before this restoration oracle and after, you get 97 verses exactly. So right there in the center of Ezekiel's judgment oracles against the nation, there is hope for Israel. Clearly, these 2 concepts, judgment on nations and restoration for Israel, are linked together. Well, let's take a look at a little chart that kind of depicts this structure for us, probably in a better way than I could just describe it with my mouth. Look at this chart. All right, so here we are. We have the 7 nations here, kind of in this pinkish red color, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the Tyre, Sidon packet, chapters 26 to 28, there are 7 oracles. The Egypt packet, 7 oracles. And then to the left and to the right, we have our 97 verses. Now, isn't that interesting? Well, Ezekiel is going to address the near neighbors of Judah in a clockwise pattern starting from the north. So we got Ammon, and then Moab, and then Edom, and then Philistia. He's going to walk through these 4 nations. And these guys were all allies of Judah, and they all together, allies with Judah, and they all together rebelled against Babylon. And Babylon, knows that he's going to put this revolt down. We're going to crush this revolt of all these nations together. So he decides, I'm going to destroy one of these nations. I'm just going to really crush it into the ground, but I can't decide which one. So Babylon, this is wild. It records this back in chapter 21. Babylon basically flips a coin to decide which nation to destroy. Look at this moment back in chapter 21. It's very interesting. Here we are, chapter 21. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Perform another sign act. I want you to mark 2 ways in the road, 2 ways for the sword of the king of Babylon to come. One road is going to go to the Ammonites, and the other road is going to go to Judah. Why are you marking these 2 ways? Because the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, he stands at the parting of the way. He's like, which way should I go? I really can't decide. So he uses divination. This is his flipping of a coin, where he shakes the arrows. That was one method of divination. He shakes the arrows. He consults the teraphim. He looks at the liver to decide which way to go. And he's told, go to Jerusalem. Set your battering rams against the city of David. Well, instead of lamenting the downfall of their ally, these 4 nations rejoice in the destruction of Judah. And therefore, Ezekiel says, you will face destruction too. Well, these oracles in chapter 25, they follow a consistent pattern. Take a look at this pattern with me in chapter 25. These oracles against the near neighbors of Judah. It's going to say, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. Thus says the Lord, because you said, ah ha ha, over the destruction of my sanctuary. Therefore, I'm handing you over to the people of the east, to Babylon. And after that, then you will know that I am the Lord. You see this because, therefore, then you will know pattern. Here, let's take a look at Edom. Because Edom acted revengefully against Judah, therefore I will take vengeance on Edom, and then they will know my vengeance, declares the Lord. Because the Philistines acted revengefully, therefore I will execute vengeance, then they will know. Well, unlike Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel gives us very few hints at a future restoration of the nations. However, this line, then you will know that I am Yahweh, directed to the nations, is one of those hints of a potential future restoration of the nations. You'll remember, of course, where this phrase comes from. It comes from Exodus and Yahweh's contest with Pharaoh, where he says to the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh when they see me rescue my people in this way. And if you look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 38, it says that a mixed multitude, that is, non-Jews, came out of Egypt with Israel into the wilderness. These are converts to Yahweh, believers in Yahweh. So it seems like there's the potential for restoration for the nations kind of tucked away here in these chapters. Well, these first four nations addressed in chapter 25, they're small fries, no big deal. Babylon's larger threats in the region are Tyre and Egypt. And of course, that's why Ezekiel's going to spend the majority of his content, of his space, on these two nations. And you know what? He's going to stretch his prophetic repertoire a little bit when he condemns these powerhouses. He's performed sign acts and delivered case studies and told parables. And now, against these nations, Ezekiel is going to sing two laments against these nations. So in chapter 27, in song, Ezekiel is going to imagine Tyre as a massive boat. It's going to personify Tyre as a boat. And that, of course, makes sense because Tyre is a coastal city, and Tyre has the largest and most powerful navy of the entire Mediterranean. They got filthy rich off of all those boats. So he's going to sing about Tyre as a big old boat. And this boat that is Tyre went out into the water, but then an east wind came and it struck that boat and it blew it up into pieces and it sunk to the bottom of the sea. And then everyone who's on the shoreline, looking at the destruction of this boat, they weep and they wail and they cry and they lament over the destruction of the most beautiful thing in the world, Tyre. It's destroyed. Well, in both chapters 29 and 32, Ezekiel is going to sing about Egypt as the dragon of the sea. Egypt, of course, its waters are the Nile. Well, Egypt is dominant in the Nile. However, in this song, Yahweh says, I will put a hook in your mouth, you dragon of the sea, and I will haul you up onto the shore. And then I will invite all of the birds of the heavens to come down and to feast on your flesh. I mean, it's pretty intense, right? This guy Ezekiel, he was quite the poet. Well, there are a couple of curiosities that are worth mentioning in these chapters. The first one is in chapter 28. And for centuries, church history has debated whether Ezekiel 28 is talking about the king of Tyre or is it talking about the fall of Satan. There's some pretty striking language in these chapters. Take a look at how the king of Tyre is described. All right, king of Tyre, what are you all about? The king of Tyre says, I am a god. I sit in the seat of gods. I made my heart like a god. it says that you, king of Tyre, you were in Eden. You were in Eden, the garden of God. And no less, you were an anointed guardian cherub. I mean, think about the cherubim from chapter 1. What? You were a guardian cherub on the mountain of God. However, you sinned, and therefore I cast you down from the mountain. I cast you to the ground. Um, now, a lot of people are convinced by that. They think, wow, that has to be referring to Satan. He's a guardian cherub in the Garden of Eden, but he was cast to the ground. It's Satan. Oh my goodness. Same thing with Isaiah 14. However, it seems to me that people who take this interpretation play a little bit fast and loose with the details of this chapter. Let me show you a couple of details from Ezekiel 28 which don't seem to quite fit the whole Satan theory. Let's look first let's go to the beginning of this chapter, verse 4. By your wisdom and your understanding, you made wealth for yourself. You gather gold and silver. I mean, where would Satan, possess and acquire wealth? That's kind of bizarre. By your great wisdom, you increased your wealth. Therefore, I will bring foreigners upon you. Whoa. We're going to bring foreigners to attack Satan? That's kind of strange. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. In the abundance of your trade, okay, now Satan trades things. You were filled with violence. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced by the argument that this is talking about Satan. What it seems to be describing is the king of Tyre, and he's being compared not to a cherub, I don't think, but rather to Adam, the first man who was kicked out of the garden. And there's some evidence in the Greek translation of the book of Ezekiel in the Septuagint, which seems to argue in favor of that. But it's a debated issue. Take your pick. The next curiosity I want to spend a little bit of time with is kind of an apologetic issue. So chapter 26 is going to follow the same pattern as chapter 25, the whole because, therefore, then you will know sequence. Let's take a look at that. Chapter 26. Go up to chapter 26. Because Tyre said, aha, the gate of the peoples is broken. She's mine now. Therefore, I will bring many nations against you, and these nations will destroy the walls of Tyre, break down her towers, totally decimate Tyre. And then look at verse 7. It says that I will bring Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, against Tyre. And what will he do? He will direct the shock of his battering rams against you and break down all of your towers. He will enter your gates as men enter a city when it has been breached, and he will kill all of your people. Well, the troubling with this, with Nebuchadnezzar's prophesied entrance into the city of Tyre, is that it never happened. Historically, it never happened. You see, we know from Josephus and other sources that Nebuchadnezzar besieged the island city of Tyre for 13 years. But after the 13 years, he just gave up, went back home. It wasn't until 332 that Alexander the Great of Greece was finally able to destroy the city of Tyre. And he had to turn the island into a peninsula in order to do it. So take a look at this picture. This is the city of Tyre. It used to be an island. This used to be an island. See this? This was Tyre. Alexander built like a dam, built a peninsula across this waterway in order to take over Tyre. And there you go. Now we have the present coastline as you see it here. So it was Alexander the Great who destroyed Tyre, not Babylon. So what do we do with this? Does this mean that Ezekiel is a false prophet? Well, again, we have to pay very close attention to the details of the text. In chapter 26, when it describes Nebuchadnezzar's successful attack on Tyre, just what is Nebuchadnezzar attacking? Let's return to chapter 26. Verse 8. So here we have Nebuchadnezzar, and it says that he will kill with the sword your daughters. And where are they? Your daughters on the mainland. Nebuchadnezzar will be successful not against the island, but against the mainland. And if we go back to this section that describes the destruction of the island city, it says that it wasn't the nation of Babylon, rather it was nations plural. I will bring up many nations against you. And it seems like the plural, nations, extends this prophecy into the future, imagining potential future invaders of the city of Tyre. And then on top of that, Ezekiel himself is going to acknowledge the failed siege of Nebuchadnezzar against the city of Tyre. You see, there's this curious interruption in chapter 29 where, hey, we're talking about Egypt now. In the first 16 verses, it's all about Egypt. Egypt's the dragon of the sea. We're going to take it down. But then in verse 17, now all of a sudden we're talking about Tyre again. And the date of this oracle jumps forward some 16 years. Let's look back at that chart of the chronology of Ezekiel's oracles. Look at this. Very curious. So we have all these oracles against the nations, but here in 29:17, we're going to jump all the way to 571, 16 years later, where we describe this oracle against Egypt/Tyre. Now, if it's 16 years later, well, that, of course, means that it's after Nebuchadnezzar's 13-year failed siege. And look what it says here in 29:17. I know you're curious now. Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, he made a hard labor against Tyre. He was working as hard as he can to defeat Tyre. But the thing is, neither he nor his army got anything from Tyre to pay them for all the labor that he performed against her. Therefore, God says, you know what? Nebuchadnezzar is working for me. I'm going to give him his money. Behold, I will give to Nebuchadnezzar the land of Egypt, and that will be his wages for his army. Isn't that fascinating? God's word cannot be broken. I love that. Well, this whole section, this oracles against the nations, it is bracketed by chapter 24 and chapter 33. Or better yet, the oracles against the nations interrupt chapter 24 and chapter 33. Take a look at how these two chapters, 24 and 33, are themselves tied together. Look at this. All right, now we're trying to figure out what is this oracles of the nations doing in the middle here. So remember that the final sign act in this judgment section of 12 to 24, God says, the delight of your eyes, your soul's desire, your wife, Ezekiel, will die. And on that day, when I destroy Jerusalem, I'm going to send a fugitive to Babylon to carry the news to you. And when that fugitive arrives there in Babylon, your mouth will be opened and you will no longer be mute. Well, let's jump now to chapter 33. I think it's verse 21. In the 12th year of our exile, guess what? A fugitive arrived from Jerusalem. He said, the city is struck down. And what happened? My mouth was opened and I was no longer mute, Ezekiel says. So this chapter, chapter 33, functions as a transition. A fundamental change has happened within the role of Ezekiel. He's going to transition now from being a prophet of judgment now to being a prophet of hope. He's completed his role as a watchman. He announced the destruction of the city successfully, and he has delivered his soul. So, of course, this links to his commission in chapter 3. And then he's going to repeat his counsel from chapter 18, where he says that there is always hope for the repentant remnant to share in the restoration promised to them. And we're going to take a look at length at that restoration in 34 to 48 next.